Well, I'll tell our guests a little bit about Allyn before we get started. Now, Allyn is a wonderful person. She began reading tarot in '71 after discovering her first deck in an occult shop in San Francisco, California. She joined the American Tarot Association and is a recognized certified tarot reader. And she's given a lot of readings online and been a guest on a number of radio shows, most recently ours this evening. She's also got a lot of knowledge about Hermeticism and alchemy, so that's the subject we'll be discussing this evening. Well, Allyn, welcome to the show. Allyn, are you there?
Yes, I am, Steve. How are you?
Oh, I'm great, Allyn. I'm so glad that you're with us. We thought you weren't going to be available, so we were starting to talk about alchemy, but I'm so glad that you're here.
Oh, yes. I was by the phone the whole time, and for some reason, it just disconnected the first time. But I'm on now, so that's all that matters.
Great. Well, I told our guests, our listeners, and my co-hosts a little bit about your work, and I started to introduce the subject of alchemy, saying that most people think of men with white beards conducting experiments in their attics in the 1600s. And although we know that we can transmute lead into gold, that there's much more to the subject allegorically. So I wanted to ask, Allyn, if you could start by just telling us a little bit about alchemy so that we can introduce the subject.
Well, you're absolutely right, Steve. Alchemy is kind of a fuzzy concept in the mind of most people today. You know, often it's thought of as an antiquated method of transforming lead into gold, and with utter folly. There might be an idea that spirituality has something to do with it, but a clearer connection usually is not made. I think the main reason why alchemy is such a fog is that it's a complicated subject, and the records were coded to protect the sacred from the profane or from the uninitiated, and the last reason being that many of the records were simply destroyed. The thing to remember about alchemy, probably if we were to assign a key word, the key word would be transformation. Alchemy is about changing one thing into another with the intention to perfect or evolve the subject at hand. And I think why alchemy is so important is because even though it dates back thousands of years, it's relevant today because it has universal principles that apply to all levels of the physical, mental, and spiritual realms. These principles are also known as the perennial philosophy, which is a term that comes up in alchemy and probably nowhere else. The perennial philosophy has three universal principles. The first is that higher levels of reality determine our existence and can only be grasped by the higher faculties of our mind and spirit. The second principle is that there is an undying divine essence at the heart of everything. And in alchemy, this is known as the quintessence, or the fifth element. And the third principle of the perennial philosophy is that all human beings possess the capacity to perceive these separate levels of reality, and that the application of this truth is the goal and purpose of our existence. So I think that about sums up what alchemy is. It is about changing one thing into another thing with the intention to perfect or evolve the subject at hand. And that can be applied in many different ways, of course.
Wonderful, thank you. I know that most people think of metals, don't they? They think of transmuting lead into gold, but they don't realize necessarily, and I didn't realize originally until you told me, that in actual fact alchemy is about the purification of anything, and particularly the purification of our souls.
Yes. And this is probably the most important aspect of alchemy that people have trouble dealing with, or they have trouble understanding. I think certainly in the beginning, alchemy was about working with the metals, but it also focused on, the alchemists also made themselves a part of the experiment. The spiritual work in alchemy focuses on purifying or rectifying the first matter within, which is what I just spoke about, that underlying divine essence at the heart of everything. And it thereby perfects the soul of the alchemist. Just as quantum physics understands now that just observing a quantum experiment can affect its outcome, so did the alchemists understand that in order to create purity, the alchemist had to be pure too. The alchemist was an ingredient in his own work. Ora et labora, which means pray and work in Latin, was important to the alchemist. They actually had something called an oratorium or a curtain chamber in their laboratories where they could meditate and pray and be pure. It's likened, I think, to kitchen alchemy or the kitchen alchemist. We all know that a good cook is a good cook because they love their work and they approach their cooking, their recipe, with an attitude of purity. Let's keep the counters clean. Let's disinfect everything before we cook. Let's make sure that the food is fresh or organic, and the fresher the ingredients and the more lovingly the cook puts the ingredients together, the more successful the dinner will be. And in so doing, the cook gains, if I can use this analogy, so much, pleasure from that experience. And I don't know that the alchemists in the Middle Ages experienced pleasure through their trials and tribulations around the furnace, but they certainly gleaned spiritual discipline in their work.
And can you tell us a little about some of the most famous alchemists that did work with the transmutation of lead into gold?
Yes, it's very surprising, actually, that, we all hear that gold was actually never produced, but actually several alchemists claimed that they did produce gold. I can certainly tell you about some of the major alchemists, and they all have very interesting backgrounds. Abu Musa Jabir ibn Hayyan, and I won't test you on that name, but he was one of the very famous Muslim Arabian alchemist, and he was really a meticulous alchemist. He codified everything, though, to the point that it was a long time before anyone could understand what he was talking about. He did this, of course, to keep his work secret. And his name is where we get the word gibberish from today. Abu Musa Jabir became gibberish today in today's vernacular. St. Thomas Aquinas was one of the world's greatest philosophers and a prolific writer in the fields of religion, philosophy, and alchemy. And most people don't realize that he was an alchemist. And he had a mystical experience in December of 1273. And apparently he never wrote a word, and what he was writing at the time was just stopped mid-sentence. Roger Bacon became Europe's leading alchemist, and he worked with gunpowder and powerful tinctures and elixirs. Bacon produced the Opus Majus, the major work, which we know it as, which summarized all branches of science at that time, and proposed that they were all part of a single true philosophy that had been lost to mankind. And even though Roger Bacon was a monk, he was always in trouble with the church. And when he died in 1294, his fellow monks nailed all his books in his library to their shelves and left them there to rot unopened. Giordano Bruno gave public lectures on the principles of the Emerald Tablet, and he portrayed the universe as a living presence. He even asserted, if you can believe this, that the sun was the center of the cosmos, and went so far as to claim that the universe was infinite and contained many other worlds that harbored intelligent life. The man was really ahead of his time. The priests of the Inquisition caught up to him in about 1592, I think, and finally, after his grueling experience with the Inquisition, they burned him at the stake. Paracelsus, as one of the greatest alchemists of all time, is considered one of the founders of modern medicine because he began using chemicals, or as we call them today, drugs, in the treatment of disease. And his hybrid of alchemy and medicine, which he called iatrochemistry, became very popular in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, you asked about alchemists who actually created gold. And the best story, the two stories I have that follow, are Nicholas Flamel and Sir Isaac Newton. Nicholas Flamel, who was memorialized in the Harry Potter books, if you will recall, was an alchemist he was just a bookstore owner, actually, and he suddenly became very rich. And he gave huge sums of money and property away to charities. And he claimed that the source of his great inheritance was from the ability to produce gold from lead. And his story is really a fascinating tale. He received a mysterious book from a Jewish priest, and the book was written in strange languages, and with the help actually of a linguist in France, he was able to decode the book and became fabulously wealthy with his alchemical gold. First of all, he did wonders for France, and he donated many hospitals and schools for children, and he just gave all of his money away because he felt that alchemical gold could be the source of all evil, if not careful. So he just did good things with his money. The story is also interesting because after Nicholas Flamel died at a ripe old age, his nephew, who inherited this mysterious book, demonstrated that he could also make gold out of lead in front of a French nobleman. And word got around, and he was arrested, and the nobleman wanted his secrets and killed him, actually, for his secrets, and built his own laboratory and of course failed to make chemical gold. And after the nobleman died, the book mysteriously disappeared. However, there are pages of it that you can still find at flamelcollege.org, which is a site I recommend. One alchemist that most people are not even aware was an alchemist was Sir Isaac Newton. And he's famous for his master achievement, mathematical principles of natural philosophy, usually referred to as the Principia, which is probably more familiar to our listeners, and considered the single most influential book ever written, actually. Sir Isaac Newton was considered always a scientist, but he considered himself first and foremost an alchemist and focused more on alchemy than any other subject. Newton claimed, as a matter of fact, that his inspiration for the laws of light and the theory of gravity sprang from his alchemical work. And he did, as a matter of fact, in his records, record that he produced gold from lead. And he said something real simple about it, like, I reckon this is the goal of alchemy, or something to that effect. Anyway, all of his alchemical books were not considered worthy of publishing, but they do reside, I believe, now in the Hebrew Museum in Jerusalem, or somewhere in Israel. So those are the two that I know of, or that claimed to have produced alchemical gold. But as a matter of fact, there were worries about alchemical gold in Europe. I hope I'm not rambling, Steve. Stop me.
No, this is fantastic, and I'm really glad that you're going down this route, actually, Allyn. I know that you're very psychic, but you were reading my mind, because I wanted to ask, why was it so dangerous to be an alchemist?
Yes.
Because I think that leads us to an understanding of how some of the metaphysical knowledge that we're also interested in has been kept secret, really, for a very long time.
Yes, well, it was dangerous because it was, this work of the occult, it was dangerous on many levels, Steve. So let me just go where I was heading first, and then I'll try to address other parts of your question. It was dangerous to the nobility of Europe at the time because they were afraid that so many alchemists were producing gold that it would throw off their monetary systems, because at that time, money and wealth was actually based on the amount of gold that you had in hand, very, right there in your hand. They didn't worry about it too much after that because they realized that they could print money. Also, there were people like the puffers who would claim that they made gold. Puffers, I should clarify, were folks that actually didn't make gold, but they pretended that they did, and they called them puffers because they would sit in front of their furnaces and fan and fan and fan and create these very hot furnaces because they thought only heat would create the gold. And the puffers would produce sort of a false gold, or a fool's gold, if you will. And that could also get them killed, burned at the stake, or have their heads cut off at the guillotine. The church during the Renaissance regarded alchemy as an occult practice. The alchemists, like Giordano Bruno, for example, who claimed that the sun was the center of the earth and the universe was infinite and contained other worlds and harbored intelligent life, was totally against the doctrine of the church at that time. And the church was, of course, everything in Europe. It was the law in Europe. So anyone who was practicing alchemy or witchcraft or herbology or anything that could be considered an occult practice were burned at the stake on a regular basis. And there's an interesting story to this, because the alchemists always had to work with women. And this is another thing that most people don't understand about alchemy. Alchemy is very much a dance of male and female energies, and whatever happens in the laboratory in terms of the coagulation of the metals and the separation of the metals also happens between the alchemist and their assistant. The women were called moon sisters, and they were very, very much in danger should they be caught in this practice, even more so than the men, because there was so much fear of witchcraft in those days. Witches and their cats, unfortunately, were burned at the stake. The cats were thrown alive in baskets in the fire, which is just horrible to think about.
I can't believe they would burn cats. Sorry, I'm not worried about the witches, but I have 4 cats, Allyn, and that bothers me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear what you said, Stephen.
I said I can't believe they would burn cats.
Oh, I know.
I'm not being cruel about the women, but I have 4 cats.
Oh my gosh! Well, and here's what happened, Stephen. Here's the interesting part. There were so many cats lost during the Inquisition and these public burnings that the rat population exploded, which contributed to the spread of the plague or the Black Death. And ironically, it was the alchemists that were asked to help in this situation. The very people who had caused the Black Death turned to the alchemists for their tinctures and their elixirs and their medicine to help cure not only the plague, but also all the other things and diseases that were spreading across Europe at that time. So I think that would probably cover the dangers of alchemy, and I think the dangers of alchemy really drove so many alchemists underground in their work to avoid conflict with the church, to keep their head on their shoulders, and to avoid the being burned alive. The alchemists deliberately, they either went into hiding completely, or they deliberately concealed their work in Christian terminology. In other words, they substituted Christian terminology for alchemical terminology. For instance, the word Christ was often used to refer to the philosopher's stone. And like I said, yeah.
And that's interesting. That's interesting because I want to ask you about the philosopher's stone. And before that, I want to ask you about the fact that these alchemists were basically vilified by the church and by the state because they were, in effect, investigating something that threatened the wealth and power or control and authority of the church and the royalty in most, if not all, cases at that time. And it makes me pretty sure that, in effect, it was about preventing people from understanding spiritual truth, understanding metaphysics, relics and almost hoarding knowledge to retain control. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree with that. Alchemy goes back thousands and thousands of years to the ancient Egyptians, and they believed that a god of theirs called Thoth, or Thoth, sometimes it's pronounced, or Thoth, T-O-T-H. We don't really know how to pronounce the name, but he was a very important god to the Egyptians because he was credited with teaching all forms of culture: mathematics, language, writing, agriculture, and certainly the perennial philosophy, which came to the Egyptians via the Pillars of Hermes. Thoth was called Hermes by the Greeks, and Hermes became Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes thrice great. And this information came to the Egyptians, according to the oral tradition, 12,000 years ago, before the Great Flood inundated the world. And actually, the pillars are described in scrolls and were actually studied. We have a historical record that the pillars existed, because we have historical record that they were studied firsthand by Alexander the Great, Manetho, who was a Greek record keeper or scribe, and Herodotus, a very famous Greek historian. And the Pillars of Hermes also contained hundreds of priceless manuscripts, one known as the Emerald Tablet, bearing a succinct summary of the Thothian philosophy. And I think that's what you're getting at, Steve. The Thothian philosophy is all about how the world was created and how we are co-creators, and how alchemy is a practice of co-creation. The first premise of the Emerald Tablet is as above, so below, as we've all heard so many times if we've studied metaphysics at all. The second is that God in the Emerald Tablet is called the One Mind, which is so important today in New Thought, as it was to the ancients. And I love what the Emerald Tablet says about the pattern of God, if you will, was in His Word, and the pattern was spread all over the universe, the Earth and the planets. And that's why we can explain, and how we can explain, the correspondences that exist between what is in the below and what is in the above, and why there are correspondences to all things Saturnian or Mercurian or Venusian, etc., because the pattern exists, and we can recognize it and identify it, and once we learn to do that, we can co-create with it. And I think of all the sacred messages of alchemy, those messages were the most threatening to the state and to the religion, which were one and the same of the time of the Middle Ages, of the Dark Ages.
Well, it's fascinating, and you've got an amazing knowledge of the whole history of the subject. And we're going to take a short commercial break, and then afterwards I'd like to ask you about how we correlate in effect what we read nowadays about the law of attraction and alchemy, or specifically spiritual alchemy, and then also to ask you about the correlations, and specifically correlations with tarot, which I know is a great passion of yours.
All right, I'll be here.
Wonderful. We'll be back in just a moment after the break.
A new era in psychic services has begun. PsychicAccess.com. You can connect with our psychic advisors by telephone or chat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All of our psychic advisors are interviewed, fully verified, and accuracy tested, assuring you quality service. We're living in some very troubled times right now. More and more, the world's problems are affecting us on a personal level. You don't have to deal with this alone. Our highly accurate psychics, caring advisors, and talented mediums can help with situations you are currently experiencing and can let you know what the future may hold for you. All new customers get a free 6-minute reading. All you have to do is register. Why not visit us now and get a free reading at PsychicAccess.com.
Well, welcome back, Alan. I want to ask you now to help our listeners and me to make a connection between the law of attraction that we read so much about at the moment and spirituality or spiritual alchemy.
The law of attraction and spiritual alchemy. Well, Stephen,
because I'm thinking
sure
that,
I understand your question. Maybe you could give me a little example.
Yeah, well, I was thinking that the alchemists were punished, vilified for pursuing this knowledge, how to purify themselves, how to purify their souls, and therefore heighten their ability to make things happen in the seemingly physical world. And I loved what you were saying about the spiritual purification, that the alchemist is part of the process. So in other words, if you don't work on yourself, you're not necessarily going to get the results in the outer world that you might want. And we read so much about the law of attraction, and there are so many books out there that tell us the importance of visualizing what it is we want to create, etc. But they don't explain what you explained, which is we have to purify ourselves, and that spirit or the universe or God, whichever term we wish to use, rewards us with greater alchemical ability or a greater ability to manifest when we are purifying ourselves, our spirits, our souls.
Yes, Steve, and that is very well put. And I can I can speak to that subject now because I understand more clearly. I think probably one of the most practical applications I can think of that has come up in my life over and over again. I'm a tarot reader, as you know, and many times most people will come to me, most women especially, when they want a reading, and they will ask, why haven't I found a really wonderful man in my life? And you know, it always turns out that there's something about the woman herself that is attracting the wrong kind of man. I know this is common because I went through the same phase. I can speak personally to it, where I had I had a lot of things to work through in my life that I hadn't worked through and I wasn't interested in working through, and therefore I kept meeting people that were harmful to me. And I was meeting those people because I was harmful to myself. And Steve, I think this is the crux of the matter. When you start to work, when an individual starts to work on themselves and picking apart all the areas in their characters that are not working for them, discerning what is working for them and what is not working for them, and understanding that they can, through using tools like visualization and working with affirmations and being conscious daily of our thoughts, words, and deeds, knowing that all of our thoughts, especially radiates out into the ether, if you will, and attract light. Then we begin to see, when we see changes in ourselves, we begin to see changes outside of ourselves. When we've cleaned up our act, in other words, we can see that our life changes for the better in the world around us. I think another classic example of this is the program Alcoholics Anonymous. They understand this concept that there is a higher self, and they aspire to develop the higher self and trust in the higher self and believe in the higher self and develop the higher self. And when that happens, all of the issues around addiction and all of the ramifications of addiction fall away a lot easier. So I hope that addresses how it works, how like attracts like. When we become better people, we are able to manifest a greater and truer reality for ourselves.
I love it. I love it, Allyn. I love the Hermetic expression, as above, so below. But I also believe that we should be saying something along the lines of as above, as within, so without. In other words, the work that we do on ourselves, our inner work, gives us a great ability to create beyond ourselves and in the world.
Absolutely, Steve. One of the things, another practice that I've had a great deal of experience with, is just saying over and over again, is that my life is abundant, and I say it in the present, that these affirmations need to be spoken out loud and believed with all of our heart. That emotion that we carry with our affirmation gives that affirmation power and strength.
Yes.
It really gives it. And so if we can just generate a feeling of gratitude and love and goodness in our
and
hearts,
really putting the energy and the passion into
Yeah.
it. I was talking with a friend who said to me, gosh, I know you've had a hard time financially. And I said, well, I have, but I'm so incredibly wealthy. And he looked at me like I was strange. And I said, no, I mean it. I'm so wealthy. I'm doing what I love. I'm no longer in a corporate role that I dislike. I'm doing what I find meaningful. I have 4 beautiful cats. I have great friends. I have a wonderful home. Yes, sometimes it's a challenge to find what I need to make the mortgage, but I'm doing what I'm passionate about in the world. I feel good. I sleep well. I'm able to do my yoga and to learn and study the things that I love. And I am in an incredible state of wealth. And money is a technicality. It will follow my passion and appreciation of the wealth that I have in this world. And I really believe that, Allyn, I really do. And I want to ask you now about tarot, because I know that you have an enormous knowledge of tarot. And I know from my studies and also from my previous interactions with you that there's this incredible correlation between spirituality, alchemy, our ability to manifest, and these incredible metaphysical tools that we have access to, such as astrology, numerology, and tarot. So how can you explain for us, Allyn, the correlation between our discussion about alchemy and the metals, lead, gold, silver, etc., copper, and this wonderful tool, tarot?
Well, boy, that's a big question. I think tarot is one of the most amazing tools that we have. I believe it speaks to us on so many different levels, right from paying the bills to, having a a bankrupt soul, if you will. And I think that according to the Brotherhood of Light tradition, tarot, the word, let me back up a little bit here. I'm thinking a little bit ahead of myself. Tarot is a word that has many, many times been associated with the word taroki in the etymology of the word tarot. Taroki, as you know, is a game that was played in the Renaissance, a card game, much like trumps. It's a game of trumps. But in the Brotherhood of Light tradition, which comes from an Egyptian tradition, the word ta in ancient Egyptian means path, and ro means royal. So the word tarot or tarot means royal path. And so the initiations, according to our oral traditions, initiations into the mystery school were conducted in the Great Pyramid, and afterwards the neophyte was led blindfolded to a subterranean chamber of the Great Sphinx, where images of the major arcanum were displayed in bas reliefs, and below each 22 major arcanum was an admonition, we call it, or a spiritual teaching that the initiate was to remember. As an aside, Dr. Robert Schoch, who I traveled to Egypt with just over the holidays, he's a famous American geologist and the one who redated the Sphinx, and author of the Pyramid Code and Forgotten Civilization, both great books, actually claims there is actually claims that there is a subterranean chamber beneath the Sphinx, the one that, what we believe in the Brotherhood of Light tradition, was where the neophyte went after initiation into the major arcanum. So the tarot, probably in its ultimate interpretation, teaches us, gives us a path to ourselves, to understanding ourselves. It describes who we are as human beings, and it gives us a way or information, a pathway to discover our total self, to combine our consciousness with our subconscious, and to become total whole people and perfect people. And perfect being the adept, as is symbolized by the world in most decks. In our deck, the world is called the adept. And the adept is one who can manifest on all three planes, on the physical plane, on the astral or mental plane, and on the spiritual plane. An adept is one who can co-create on all those planes. And I do believe tarot is really a blueprint for arriving at that great achievement. Most of us don't, but we give it our best shot.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. I mean, well, I know you've been using tarot for a long time. Can you give us a couple of examples of cards in probably, I presume, in the major arcana that explain certain steps in that process of spiritual purification, this opportunity that enables us to become more spiritual, more of God, and therefore more powerful in our ability to create in the world, but to create not out of selfishness for ourselves, but to create in the way that wonderful alchemists did, creating to give and help others?
Yes. Well, I would be happy to do that. I gave an hour-and-a-half speech one time on the Magus alone, And I'll start with the Magus. The Magus, referred to in most decks as the Magician, of course, is Major Arcanum 1. And he is the first step towards spirituality. And he's the first step because that card symbolizes the beginning in our venture and can be likened to the first matter of alchemy. I don't know if you understand what first matter is. Maybe I should go back and explain first matter. The alchemical process is traditionally begun in the spring with what is called first matter. First matter is called prima materia in Latin, and it is one of the most confusing concepts in alchemy because it's considered everything and nothing at once. The Emerald Tablet calls first matter the one thing, the primordial chaos, if you will, the primordial soup of the universe, fashioned into material reality by the thoughts or words of the one mind. And we are all part of that one mind. We are like little computer terminals of the great computer in the sky, if you will. Or we can plug into electricity that doesn't exist really in that little plug in our wall that lights our lamps, but yet it's out there and we can plug into it. That's how we are connected to the one mind. We live, breathe, and move and exist within the one thing and the one mind that we co-create with. The Magus is like first matter. It is the energy of this first major arcanum that tells us that we lie within the realm of all possibilities. It is the stuff of God, or the creative energy within which we live. The Magus is ruled by Mercury, the planet ruling our thoughts. And it is our thoughts that indeed mold and shape our personal existence. And it's global thoughts that mold and shape the conditions of the world. If we change our thoughts, we can change our lives. Today, quantum physics has demonstrated what metaphysicians have known for a long time, that it is that matter does not exist in and of itself in the universe, but rather emerges from a quantum foam or first matter and manifests according to consciousness. And if the Magus does not represent anything else, it represents consciousness. And this revelation is the basis of what today is referred to as new thought. But of course, it's actually not new thought. It's the wisdom of the ancients. The ancients knew that we can create and manifest with our thoughts by keeping them positive and present, and by being aware constantly. And one of the key words for the Magus or the Magician is vigilance, which means being constantly aware of not only your surroundings and the people in your surroundings, but of your thoughts, words, and deeds, because they are all so powerful, and they can all co-create, whether we think they are or not. So that's how I would relate the Magus to alchemy as first matter. Veiled Isis, Arcanum 2, she's called the High Priestess in other decks, is just the opposite of the Magus, who is masculine and positive and or aggressive and represents the conscious mind. Veiled Isis represents the feminine principle, that is negative and or passive, and the subconscious mind. Now, mind you, I'm not trying to be sexist here. Positive and negative in this context means a lock and key system. In other words, you have to have a plug and a receptacle to deliver the electricity. In other words, all of us as men and women combine feminine and masculine, passive and aggressive, positive and negative traits. The Magus and veiled Isis, or the magician and the high priestess together, symbolize the human condition. The one, Arcanum 1, cannot exist without the other, Arcanum 2. Carl Jung incorporated alchemy into his groundbreaking work by attempting to integrate the personality. And this integration, as he termed it, meant the balancing of the four personality types based on the humors of Hippocrates, which were based on the four elements, fire, water, air, and earth. And part of Jung's integration process is discovering the underlying subconscious personality and bringing it into consciousness. So it would be our job as humans to try to integrate our subconscious and conscious minds. Now, in the next card, which we call Isis Unveiled, and I've forgotten what it's called in the other decks. What is she called? The Empress? Or the Empress, I think. The Empress is traditionally pregnant, correct? So in the Empress, in Arcanum 3, we have a combination of the consciousness and the subconsciousness, which creates a new something wonderful, new and different, that transcends the original two. The Strength card, we call it the Strength card. I think you call it the Strength card. Or in other traditions, it's called the Strength card. The Egyptians were very keen on separating the animal nature from the human nature. You know, we're born animals. We have animal appetites. We have a lizard brain with a flight or fright reaction, flight or fight reaction. And
do I have a lizard brain as well, Allyn?
Pardon me?
Do I have a lizard brain as well?
I'm afraid we all do, Steve.
Oh.
And you know where we discover those? We discover those when we're in traffic.
I love talking about the third eye and the fact that certain lizards still have that visible third eye, but that ours went into the forehead or is behind the skull, but it still detects light. It's fascinating. Well, Allyn, we're going to have you back on another show, because we've only really just started to talk about your incredible knowledge of tarot, and you mentioned Egypt. We're all very passionate about Egypt as well, and we've run out of time, but I would like you to come back and tell us more about tarot and Egypt and the Church of Light. Would you be able to do that sometime?
Of course, I would love to.
You've been a wonderful, wonderful guest. This is one of those shows that I will listen to over and over, because there's so much I can learn and memorize from what you've said.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I want to thank you sincerely. I wish we had more time, but I wanted to just ask you very quickly before we do wrap up, can you tell our guests how they can contact you if they'd like to know more about your work?
They can contact me at the following email address: ally@light.org, and that's ALI at light.org.
That's wonderful, Ally. And we also have a link to you with your information on our guest page. So on the psychicaccesstalkradio.com website, we have a guest page for all of our guests, and yours is there, so our listeners can contact you that way as well. And we will definitely have you back. I will be in touch, and I want to thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us this evening.
Thank you, Steve, so much. Good night.
Good night, Ali. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Res Miranda. If you're having relationship, career, or life issues, I'm inviting you to experience what it's like to have access to professional, highly accurate psychics and spiritual advisors you can trust to care and help you. Register now to get your free 6-minute reading by telephone or chat. Get answers. Get access. Psychic access. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. PsychicAccess.com.
They think of transmuting lead into gold, but they don't realize necessarily, and I didn't realize originally until you told me, that in actual fact alchemy is about the purification of anything, and particularly the purification of our souls.
Yes. And this is probably the most important aspect of alchemy that people have trouble dealing with, or they have trouble understanding. I think certainly in the beginning, alchemy was about working with the metals, but it also focused on, the alchemists also made themselves a part of the experiment. The spiritual work in alchemy focuses on purifying or rectifying the first matter within, which is what I just spoke about, that underlying divine essence at the heart of everything. And it thereby perfects the soul of the alchemist. Just as quantum physics understands now that just observing a quantum experiment can affect its outcome, so did the alchemists understand that in order to create purity, the alchemist had to be pure too. The alchemist was an ingredient in his own.
Well, tell our guests a little bit about Allyn before we get started. Now, Allyn is a wonderful person. She began reading tarot in 71 after discovering her first deck in an occult shop in San Francisco, California. She joined the American Tarot Association and is a recognized certified tarot reader. And she's given a lot of readings online and been a guest on a number of radio shows, most recently ours this evening. She's also got a lot of knowledge about Hermeticism and alchemy, so that's the subject we'll be discussing this evening. Well, Allyn, welcome to the show. Allyn, are you there?
Yes, I am, Steve. How are you?
Oh, I'm great, Allyn. I'm so glad that you're with us. We thought you weren't going to be available, so we were starting to talk about alchemy, but I'm so glad that you're here.
Oh, yes. I was by the phone the whole time, and for some reason, it just disconnected the first time. But I'm on now, so that's all that matters.
Great. Well, I told our guests, our listeners, and my co-hosts a little bit about your work, and I started to introduce the subject of alchemy, saying that most people think of men with white beards conducting experiments in their attics in the 1600s. And although we know that we can transmute lead into gold, that there's much more to the subject allegorically. So I wanted to ask, Allyn, if you could start by just telling us a little bit about alchemy so that we can introduce the
work. Ora et labora, which means pray and work in Latin, was important to the alchemist. They actually had something called an oratorium or a curtain chamber in their laboratories where they could meditate and pray and be pure. It's likened, I think, to kitchen alchemy or the kitchen alchemist. We all know that a good cook is a good cook because they love their work and they approach their cooking, their recipe, with an attitude of purity. Let's keep the counters clean. Let's disinfect everything before we cook. Let's make sure that the food is fresh or organic, and the fresher the ingredients and the more lovingly the cook puts the ingredients together, the more successful the dinner will be. And in so doing, the cook gains, if I can use this analogy, so much, pleasure from that experience. And I don't know that the alchemists in the Middle Ages experienced pleasure through their trials and tribulations around the furnace, but they certainly gleaned spiritual discipline in their work.
Subject.
Well, you're absolutely right, Steve. Alchemy is kind of a fuzzy concept in the mind of most people today. Often it's thought of as an antiquated method of transforming lead into gold, and with utter folly. There might be an idea that spirituality has something to do with it, but a clearer connection usually is not made. I think the main reason why alchemy is such a fog is that it's a complicated subject, and the records were coded to protect the sacred from the profane or from the uninitiated, and the last reason being that many of the records were simply destroyed. The thing to remember about alchemy, probably if we were to assign a key word, the key word would be transformation. Alchemy is about changing one thing into another with the intention to perfect or evolve the subject at hand. And I think why alchemy is so important is because even though it dates back thousands of years, it's relevant today because it has universal principles that apply to all levels of the physical, mental, and spiritual realms. These principles are also known as the perennial philosophy, which is a term that comes up in alchemy and probably nowhere else. The perennial philosophy has three universal principles. The first is that higher levels of reality determine our existence and can only be grasped by the higher faculties of our mind and spirit. The second principle is that there is an undying divine essence at the heart of everything. And in alchemy, this is known as the quintessence, or the fifth element. And the third principle of the perennial philosophy is that all human beings possess the capacity to perceive these separate levels of reality, and that the application of this truth is the goal and purpose of our existence. So I think that about sums up what alchemy is. It is about changing one thing into another thing with the intention to perfect or evolve the subject at hand. And that can be applied in many different ways, of course.
Wonderful, thank you. I know that most people think of metals, don't they?